Today we're going to look at some of the new cards from the Murders at Karlov Manor set to have a look at some cards that can fit into existing decks or maybe some that can make new decks come to life. We're going to break down some of these cards, not all of them because it takes way too long, and yeah, just go through my top cards of the set. So here we go. Welcome back to the channel. All right, today we're going to have a look at these cards from Murders at Karlov Manor, and we're going to see, we're going to break down some of the cards. We're going to see which ones partially can be like maybe slotting into the top forming meta decks that are going to get you, the highest win rate possible. We're also going to look at some cards that are maybe the best budget cards that are more accessible to the majority of players, and also some cards I like that just look fun to play because although Arena incentivizes wins, and sure you want to get wins to get your gold and everything like that, we also just want to play the game to have fun. So I'm going to have a look at some cards I think will be fun to play, even if they're not the absolute top win rate. So first of all, first card I'm going to look at, and don't forget, like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. The first card I'm going to look at is Case of the Gateway Express. Now this looks like a kind of good card. It's an uncommon to go into a deck that goes really wide, which is relatively easy with budget decks. So whenever the case enters the battlefield, and the case is a new enchantment type, I'm sure you've heard of already, you choose a target creature you don't control, and each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. So the more creatures you have, the more damage you do to a creature. You're going to remove something for 2 mana pretty much. Then to solve this case, you need to attack with 3 or more creatures this turn, on your turn. And obviously if you're going wide in a token deck or a cheap budget creature deck, it's going to be relatively easy. And then once you've solved that, creatures you control get +1/+0. Now, I don't know if this is going to replace things in maybe like human tribal decks, because we already have Coppercoat Vanguard, which is a really good 2 mana creature that adds +1 power to all your other creatures and Ward 1. So it doesn't remove things though. So it kind of covers both things. It might find a place in there. Some people are going to try it out. Yeah, to have removal, and it's kind of like Brutal Cathar. You have removal and you have power involved as well. But there's an extra step. Plus, you could use this possibly in Selesnya enchantment decks, because cases, obviously, are enchantments, so they'll trigger things. You can maybe copy it with Calyx and things like that. So yeah, definitely interesting budget option for that one. The next one to have a look at is Delny Street. I can't say it. Delny Streetwise Lookout. Now, this is one that I've seen a lot of people mention. It's a 3 mana 2/2 creature. It's a human. Humans are very relevant right now. It is legendary. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. So it gives lots of your creatures potentially unblockable. And if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, the ability triggers an additional time. Things like Brutal Cathar, okay, will exile 2 things instead of 1. And there's lots of other kind of triggers that might benefit from this, that have power 2 or less. But when you have things like Coppercoat Vanguard, or the case that we just looked at, the case of the Gateway Express, which is going to add power to creatures, they're going to go above that power 2 limit, and so they won't trigger an additional time. So you kind of have to use this in a deck that isn't going to boost the power of all your creatures in the way that human tribal would do. So probably not in that kind of deck, because it's going to increase the power of your cards so that they don't work well with Delny, a bit of a nombo. But yeah, still a really good card, and for other creatures with power 2 or less, those triggers doubling is going to make a big difference. Now, there's one thing that can remove the ability to the triggers to happen for abilities to kick off, and that's Doorkeeper Thrall over here, a 2 mana 1/2 flash flying creature. Artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. So this is kind of like the Eletional Mother of Machines. It stops ETB effects only with artifacts and creatures though, so it won't shut down cases or other enchantments. But it will stop things like Portal to Phyrexia, making you sacrifice creatures, any ETB effects, Atali, Traxa, all those things. And because it's flash, you can wait until your opponent tries to do something, and when they put their ETB creature out there, you can then flash this out and stop that ability from triggering. So it's going to be kind of important, I guess, in more of a control type deck, but a tempo deck. but definitely something that's you need to look out for if you're playing. Lots of like ETB effects and things that might be shut down by this. But yeah, definitely a good card to look out for. Then we've got Novice Inspector, which is like a 3/1 Inspector. It's a 1 mana, 1/2 creature. When it enters the battlefield, it investigates. It's, going to be pretty useful. It's a common, so that's good. Might be useful in some kind of bunnycorn deck. You're making 2 non-land permanents, or as part of a control deck possibly, because then you're going to get those clue tokens. Clue tokens, obviously, going to help you draw cards and outlast your opponent. So yeah, really good budget card as well. The next one I want to go over is the 10th District Hero. Now this one's a 2 mana, 2/3 human. Like I said, human's very relevant, obviously in white as well. So it comes in as a 2/3, 2 mana, and then you can pay 2 and collect evidence 2, so that the 10th District Hero becomes a detective as well, has base power and toughness 4/4, and gains vigilance. So you're paying 4 mana overall for a 4/4 vigilance. You're paying that in pieces, as long as you can collect evidence 2. So taking something from the graveyard that's mana value 2 or more. And then you have the 3 mana ability to collect evidence 4 if it's a hero and a detective. So if you've already done that first stage, it becomes a legendary creature with a name, and it has base power and toughness 5/5, and it gains other creatures you control have indestructible. So obviously, if you're making like some kind of go wide human deck, you need to watch out for spot removal. So this is going to help, reduce the chance of you falling to anything with destroy effects. And the collect evidence is also an instant speed ability, so you can wait. If you have 3 mana up, if your opponent tries to kill one of your creatures, then you can pay the 3 mana to make everything else indestructible. But also, it's important to notice that this says other creatures gain indestructible, but it doesn't give indestructible to this creature, so the opponent can still kill this and then kill other things. But at least it should be enough. If you have a kind of go wide human aggro deck, should be enough to hold the opponent off. It means they have to kill this and not something else that maybe they'd rather kill. But yeah, I think that's going to be useful in some human decks. We'll see. Humans are doing really well at the moment, so I think this is pretty good. So that's all the white cards. We're going to move on to some blue cards now. So the first one I want to look at is the Case of the Filch Falcon over here. It's a 1 mana case, another enchantment, another case. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate. So you're making yourself a clue token. To solve, you control 3 or more artifacts. So this creates 1 artifact in itself. And blue-white has lots of artifacts already, so it doesn't seem that hard to have 3 artifacts pretty early on. And then when you have solved this, you can pay 3 mana to sacrifice this case, put 4 +1/+1 counters on a non-creature artifact you control, and it becomes a 0/0 bird creature with flying in addition to its other types. So, okay, you could sacrifice this, you could put 4 +1 counters on your blue token, which makes it useful. You can still draw a card if you need to with it, but you have a 4/4 flying bird. But what I like about this is maybe sacrificing this and putting the +1 counters on an incubator token. If you have, like the Chrome Host Seed Shark or something else, or you've done a Sunfall and now you have a big incubator token. Well, now you can sacrifice this. You can put 4 +1 counters on whatever size the incubator token is already, and then it also becomes a creature. It's already a non-creature artifact before you transform it, and then it'll become a 0/0, and whatever +1 counters it already has, it adds those on as well. So it's not just a 4/4. It could be an 8/8 or something like that. So it seems interesting in that kind of deck. It's going to be easy to have artifacts in a deck that produces incubator tokens. So I think that's going to be kind of fun. It's a really cheap card. It's an uncommon. I could see using that in that kind of artifact deck. Another one of the enchantment or cases that I can see possibly being used in maybe a Chrome Host Seed Shark kind of maybe mono blue or blue and white deck is Case of the Ransacked Lab. It's a 3 mana enchantment where instants and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. That's really useful. Makes your spells cheaper. You can cast more things. You're going to be drawing lots of cards. You're going to have lots of incubator tokens if you have like the Seed Shark. Also, what's interesting with the Seed Shark is that the incubator tokens you make are equal to the mana value of the spell that you cast, and if you're casting it for one less, that doesn't make the incubator token any smaller, it just means you can produce them faster. And to solve this, you need to cast 4 or more instant or sorcery spells in a turn, which I think is pretty possible if they're costing one less and you have lots of small spells. But you don't even need to be honest. This is going to make a 3/3 incubator token itself, and then make the other things cheaper, which is great in itself. But yeah, if you solve this, if you cast 4 or more instants or sorceries, then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. If they're all cheaper, you don't have to sacrifice this to get that. It's just whenever you solve it, you still have that one less to cast, and you get, when you cast something, you draw a spell. By that point, if the opponent can't fare well or get rid of this any other way, I think you're going to have a big enough advantage to win. As long as you survive the early game, I think by that point you're going to win. So yeah, Chrome Host Seed Shark with these kind of cards might be a new mono blue that works out a little bit differently to the Haughty Djinn deck. Although to be honest, you could possibly use that in that kind of deck as well. I think that could work out. So yeah, interesting card to use. Okay, then moving down in the blue cards. I mean, there's lots of things that are kind of interesting. I'm just going to skip through some and go to Forensic Researcher. It's a 3 mana, 1/3 Merfolk Detective creature, which gives you the ability to untap another target permanent you control by tapping this. So I can see this working out in some kind of unlimited Merfolk kind of deck, because you can untap another target permanent for no mana cost. You can get this ability on a creature using Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and then everything can tap to untap something else. In which case you just need a Deeproot Pilgrimage to be able to create more Merfolk that are hexproof whenever you tap a permanent. So you could tap this, which untaps something else, untap the other thing to tap this again, or tap the other thing to untap this again, tap this to untap the other one, and just keep going in an infinite loop. Make as many Merfolk as you want. And if you have the what's it called, the Hex Catcher one that says you get all Merfolks get +1/+1, and you can sacrifice a Merfolk instant speed, no mana cost, to make the opponent pay an extra 1 when they cast a non-creature spell. And it basically means you have unlimited kind of counter spell, making the opponent have to pay an extra 1, and then an extra 1, and an extra 1 until they run out of mana. So I can see that used in an unlimited Merfolk deck, kind of like the other unlimited mana decks you have at the moment with Kami of Whispered Hopes and the Sleep Cursed Fairy that can tap and untap over and over again. But yeah, maybe Merfolk's going to be a better deck now with some more Merfolk creatures being added in. Another one I quite like the look of, not that I play very much blue, is Lost in the Maze. So it's a 2 mana or X and 2 mana enchantment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, you tap X creatures and put a stun counter on each of the creatures you don't control, which is okay for doing it on the opponent to add some stun counters on their creatures. But it also gives you the permanent ability of tapped creatures you control have hexproof. So if the opponent is trying to target one of your creatures with some spot removal, you can basically pay 3 mana. So the X equals 1, pay 3 mana, Lost in the Maze comes out, you tap the creature they're trying to target, and it becomes hexproof and the spot removal doesn't work. This also basically means whenever you attack, as long as your creatures don't have vigilance, as long as your creatures are tapped when they're attacking, or until your next turn, they're tapped still anyway, then they're going to have hexproof basically all the time. So loads of things are going to have hexproof. It's going to be really hard for spot removal to work on lots of things when everything that's tapped has hexproof, and you can potentially with some things instant speed. We'll see if that works out. I think it seems like a good way of protecting your creatures quite a lot, even if you're only paying 2 mana to put this down and give yourself tapped creatures have hexproof. Feels like a pretty good rate. Another one people have mentioned quite a lot is Intrude on the Mind. It's a 5 mana instant where you reveal the top 5 cards of your library, separate them into 2 piles, and the opponent chooses one of the piles. You can put a pile into your hand, and the other goes into your graveyard, and you create a 0/0 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and put a +1/+1 counter on it for each card put into your graveyard this way. So you could separate the piles into 3 cards and 2 cards. Let the opponent choose whether you get, 3 cards and a 2/2 Thopter, or 2 cards and a 3/3 Thopter, or maybe you put all 5 cards into one pile, and the opponent has to either give you a 5/5 flying creature. It's an artifact which makes it resilient to go for the throat, things like that. Or that you have 5 cards, which sounds like the worst thing. But maybe you want cards in your graveyard as well because of, the collect evidence mechanics, or maybe you're reanimating something. Maybe you want things in your graveyard. So there might be there might be a situation where there's no way to win. You either give the opponent 5 cards, or you give them a relatively big creature with evasion. It could cause problems anyway. And obviously, if you have something that reduces the cost of this, not that 5 is too much, if you can reduce the cost of that to 4 or less, then it's a really, really powerful card to potentially draw 5 cards, like 5 mana pretty much. So yeah, watch out for that one in blue control decks. It's going to be really bad. It's going to be really annoying. And I think it's also going to be interesting to see if we see anyone playing Living Conundrum, the 5 mana 2/5 hexproof creature, which isn't very high rate on stats, but it has hexproof. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you skip that draw instead. So you can't lose by being milled unless something else. Well, actually, even if anything else tries to make you draw a card while your library is empty, that's not going to work. So it's not even just your draw step. If anything tries to make you draw a card, you will not draw cards. And as long as there are no cards in your library, the Living Conundrum has base power and toughness 10/10, has flying and vigilance. So, and it's also hexproof, so obviously, like, it needs something that doesn't target it to remove it. So maybe we'll see people playing, Jace and milling themselves. I mean, there's certain cases where you might want to mill yourself anyway. So having a creature like this, potentially, that becomes a 10/10 hexproof flying vigilance creature, it's going to be an interesting way to win games, and also protects you if your opponent is playing a mill deck as well. So that's going to be kind of funny. I don't think we'll see it that much, but I'd love to see someone make that work really well, considering it's only an uncommon as well. And one card that might actually go along with that might work in mill decks anyway, Reenact the Crime. So it's heavy on blue. It's a 4 mana instant where you can exile target non-land card in a graveyard, so your graveyard or the opponent's one, who was put there from anywhere this turn. So it could be killed, it could be milled, whatever it might be. You get to copy it and cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So any non-land card, so it doesn't have to be a permanent, it could be instant sorcery, it could be Breach the Multiverse, it could be a Talia Traxxer, whatever it might be. Which could work with the Living Conundrum. You might mill your own Living Conundrum and then get to reenact the crime. So you're paying 4 mana to bring that back from the graveyard, and then suddenly, you can cast that, copy, you don't pay anything, comes out as a 2/5, possibly becomes a 10/10. Could be interesting. Might try that out in some Jace decks for myself and make a video about it if it seems entertaining enough. But yeah, otherwise, you could just mill your opponent, and whatever best thing they have goes into their graveyard. Maybe you play that for free and get to copy their best thing, and it's only 4 mana. Seems pretty good. So moving on to the black cards now. The first one that stands out to me is Deadly Cover Up. So it's a 5 mana sweeper in black, which is pretty cool because black at the moment has basically what Path Peril, Gix's Command. Basically, is there anything else? I think that's it. So yeah, it's a 5 mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this, you may collect evidence 6, but you don't have to. You get to destroy all creatures. If the evidence was collected, you also exile a card from the opponent's graveyard. Search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name and exile them. That player then shuffles and draws a card for each card exiled from the hand this way. So it's a bit like the end, where you can basically remove their Sheoldreds, remove their Vitalis, if they've basically milled their own creatures or surveilled, put things into the graveyard to um, to reanimate them later on. You can collect some evidence, get rid of their reanimation target, and yeah, that's a pretty good way of getting rid of things. You can also get rid of basically any card. It doesn't have to be a non-land as well. So if your opponent maybe hasn't got enough lands out, especially if they're in a mono color, is really going to mess with them, where you can collect some evidence and you get to exile potentially a land. They have to have a land in the graveyard, so like That might not happen. Maybe you have to mill some things of theirs to make this happen. But then you could exile their basic land from the graveyard and then remove all other basic lands from their deck, basically, and their hand. So they're going to have everything that's non-lands. But if they only have like 3 lands out or something, then they'll quit because they won't have any more lands left in their deck. I don't know if that will come out, but it'd be a kind of funny way to win if it does come up. But otherwise, just remove their Jace, their Shieldred, their Atraxa, their Atali, whatever big creature they really want to rely on to finish the game. Get rid of that. They'll probably quit. And speaking of reanimation, obviously we're in black. Reanimation's pretty fun in black. We have Illicit Masquerade. It's a 4-mana enchantment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, you put an imposter counter on each creature you control. So, could just be one, could be lots, doesn't really matter. Whenever a creature you control with an imposter counter on it dies, you then exile it, return up to one other target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you could potentially put a few cards into the graveyard, have a few tokens or something out, and if the opponent tries to depopulate, wipe the board, or just kill certain things. If they try and kill 1 or 2 things, or when you're just blocking, block with something that you know is going to die, you can flash in this enchantment, put imposter counters on all the tiny creatures you have out at the moment, and every time they kill a tiny creature, a big one comes back from the graveyard. I don't know if it's going to see a lot of play, but it is definitely one that I'm going to try out and I think will be pretty fun, especially with all these really great reanimation targets. And then we have a pretty good removal spell in Long Goodbye. It's a 2-mana uncommon instant. It can't be countered and it's destroy target creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. Now, a lot of the creatures in Standard at the moment are a real pain to deal with, are mana value 3 or less. Think of things like Haughty Djinn, we have Rafine, we have Godric, there's Calix, Graveyard Trespasser, and things like the prototype of Phyrexian Fleshgorger, because this spell can't be countered. And that's why this is going to be really good for getting rid of things like Haughty Djinn, although they can Fading Hope or they can slip out the back. They can protect it still, but they can't counterspell this. So yeah, blue decks might not like this very much because it can't be countered, but it also has the reminder text on this card that this includes the ward ability. Now, some people might not always remember this, so I kind of wish it didn't have the reminder text on there, because when people forget this, it's a good way to get around, ward abilities and things. But it can't be countered. So basically, you can kill a Graveyard Trespasser without discarding a card. You can kill a Phyrexian Fleshgorger without paying a life. You can kill a Rafine without paying the extra 1. So a good way to get rid of these small creatures with with ward abilities for just 2 mana. Obviously, a good amount of them can just be killed by things like Shieldred's Edict, if it's the only thing out. Go for the Throat, if it's not an artifact. You just have to pay the extra ward. So if there's lots of creatures that get used with ward abilities that really, really are the creatures that you hate to play against, then Long Goodbye might be a good removal spell to include in the deck. But then, obviously, only being creatures or planeswalkers with mana value 3 or less means that towards the end of the game, when bigger creatures come out, it might be kind of a wasted card. So we'll see how much it gets used. I'll try it out. I don't know if it's going to take over from, the good 2-mana removal options we already have. Then moving on to a card, a 4-mana card. So, Long Goodbye couldn't kill it. This is the thing, right? That won't kill Shieldred. It is Massacre Girl, Known Killer. It's a 4-mana, 4/4 legendary human assassin with menace. And creatures you control have Wither, which means they do damage in the form of -1/-1 counters instead of just regular damage. So that damage effectively will stay there across turns. So do a little bit more damage next turn, and it will, kill the creature. So whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, you draw a card. So basically, if it's died from these -1/-1 counters. Now, the main problem with Massacre Girl, as someone pointed out in a comment previously, is that if you rely on these -1/-1 counters, then you only have Massacre Girl that's going to give creatures Wither, which basically means if you don't have Massacre Girl out on the battlefield, then if you build your deck around her, then obviously it's not going to work quite so well. But there are quite a few spells that work on giving minus minus X things anyway. Things like Virtue of Persistence will give, minus X. You might even have things like Life of Toshiro, which will give things -1/-1 to kill certain creatures. So it's not just relying on the opponent blocking your wither creatures. You can still remove their creatures with those minus toughness effects. So even if they don't get hit by your creatures and get those -1 counters, they could still die with toughness less than 1, and you still draw some extra cards. So I think this works well with things like Shieldred. I don't think it's going to replace Shieldred, but if you're drawing lots of extra cards, then you're going to be gaining life if you have Shieldred as well. Because it's legendary, obviously, you only need one on the battlefield. You can only have one on the battlefield at a time. Normally with legendary creatures, unless it's like super powerful like Shieldred, where you probably want 4 of them in your deck. With something like this, I'd probably go with 2 or 3 at the most anyway. But this is one you can get from one of the pre-order bundles, so a lot of people might be trying her out anyway because they're going to get her when they buy that bundle. But yeah, I'd try it out. Probably not going to be the top, most effective thing in black, but I think it'd be fun. Next in black we have Outrageous Robbery. So good in kind of a black control deck because you can pay X and 2 black as an instant. A target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library face down. So basically, you're going to pay at least 3 for this to get 1 card. And you may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. And if you cast a spell that way, you can spend mana as though it was mana of any color, of any type to cast it. So basically, you don't have to have treasures and other mana. You can just play this in mono black. And you get to basically just steal loads of cards from the opponent. And you get to just play. It's like drawing that many cards from the opponent's deck. Yeah, I think it's going to be a really good way of just refilling your hand in black. It's kind of like Silver Scrutiny. You're paying X and 2 extra mana to effectively draw that many cards. And it depends what the opponent has. They might have useless cards, might have cards that don't work with yours. But if they have generally good cards, then you're going to want to steal them and play them. So I think it's going to be a fun card to play in a kind of not a black aggro deck, but maybe a kind of longer, slower black mid-range or control deck. And then we have something else in black that I want to make work. I kind of feel like it's not going to, but I'd really like it if it did. Persuasive Interrogators. It's a 6 mana, 5/6 creature. So it's pretty expensive, considering it doesn't do a huge amount itself. All it does when it enters is it investigates, it creates that clue token. But whenever you sacrifice a clue, target opponent gets 2 poison counters. So you basically only have to sacrifice 5 clues to make your opponent die as long as Persuasive Interrogators is on the battlefield. Now you can pay the 2 mana to sacrifice the clues, with their ability. But you could also use any other card that, bargains or is just, sacrifice an artifact. And like Bartolome can sacrifice an artifact or creature to put a +1/+1 counter on itself. Which doesn't cost any mana. So all you have to do is have 5 clue tokens out and have Bartolome and have a Persuasive Interrogator, and then you can just instant speed sacrifice all 5 clue tokens without any mana. So that could work. Also, if you have 2 Persuasive Interrogators, or if you have one and then copy it, so you have 2 out, then each one will give the opponent 4 poison counters whenever you sacrifice a clue. So even if you just get 1 Persuasive Interrogators and then you do something else that copies it and enters as a copy, then yeah, you're going to basically have 2 clue counters. You can sacrifice both of those, you're drawing 2 cards, and there's 8 poison counters on the opponent already. And then all you have to do at that point is maybe proliferate a little bit if they manage to kill your creatures. So this could be another poison deck. I don't know if it will be, but it's going to be one I'm going to try to make work. Maybe it'll work as a budget deck. Definitely going to give it a go. In fact, another thing I didn't mention with Massacre Girl, just going to jump back, is getting those -1/-1 counters on your opponent is good on your opponent's creatures. But then if you can proliferate, you're basically going to bring all their creatures down even more and give them -1/-1 again. So then at that point, even if they kill Massacre Girl, if their creatures have -1/-1 counters on them, you can still kill those creatures. That you won't draw the card with Massacre Girl's ability, but you can still kill their creatures just by proliferating. So actually, that could come in pretty important with Massacre Girl, but also with Persuasive Interrogators. Also, while we're mentioning Massacre Girl again, we have an X and black instant, Slice from the Shadows. Spell can't be countered, which again, ward ability, but generally counter spells. Target creature gets -X till end of turn. So you get to kill something with -X. Obviously, you then draw a card if their toughness goes down to 0 and they die that way. I don't know if it'll necessarily be used in the deck with Massacre Girl. We'll try it out, but it's just nice to know there are other -X options out there. There are a few already in standard. Then the last black card I'm going to have a look at is the Vein Ripper. So it's a 6 mana flying vampire assassin 6/5 creature with the ward ability sacrifice a creature. So if they want to target it, they have to sacrifice. They have to have a creature, and they have to sacrifice, at least one of their creatures. Obviously, the other things that are like can't be countered get around this, but the Long Goodbye only affects things with mana value 3 or less. So Long Goodbye won't affect this. But yeah, so the ward ability, like you could get around this with Slice from the Shadows, but you're paying 6 to kill something. So the ward ability here is pretty useful on the bigger creature. And whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So that's your creature or their creature. They have to sacrifice a creature to target this. So if they're trying to remove this, they're probably going to have to, sacrifice something anyway, which means you're going to get the 2 life gained for you and the 2 life lost for them, even if they kill this straight away. So at least it does something, even if they kill it. They've lost a creature and they've lost 2 life, you've gained 2 life. So that's a bit of a difference. That's not nothing, if they manage to kill it straight away. So definitely going to try this out, possibly in some other kind of vampire synergy deck. Because there's a good number of vampires out at the moment, and I think they could work together pretty well. But also just in any kind of mono black deck with this as a top end, I think could work pretty well. Again, I'm not entirely convinced it's going to be like the top card or anything, but I'd definitely give it a go. So now we're going to move on to the red cards. I think are really good. So first we have a couple of cases. Again, first of all, we have the Case of the Burning Masks. It's a 3 mana case. When it enters the battlefield, does 3 damage to a creature the opponent controls. 3 mana, yeah, it's okay. When you solve it, 3 or more sources you control dealt damage this turn. So this does 1 itself. So all you have to do is 2 more sources doing damage that turn for this to be solved on that first turn. And then when it is solved, you have the ability to sacrifice it whenever you want, to exile the top 3 cards of your library, choose one of them. You may play that card this turn. That's a good way of just waiting till you need it, but being able to draw 1 extra card. So the fact that it is removal, it's also a permanent entering the battlefield, which can trigger the celebration for Godric, which is like the only card where I think celebration actually matters. But it works for that as well. And then you basically get to choose from the top 3 cards of your library, which in mono red, when you get to that point, when you're on turn 4 or 5 or something like that, that one last lightning strike is probably what you need to finish the game. So being able to choose from your top 3 gives you a bit more of a chance of finding it. So I think that will work pretty well, maybe in a budget mono red deck. Although there are quite a few good budget cards already for mono red. But what I think is even better is the next one, which is Case of the Crimson Pulse. That's also a 3 mana case, and when it enters the battlefield, you discard a card and draw a card. So it does that whole thing, drawing a card, discarding a card, drawing 2 more, like lots of other things do. This costs 3 rather than 2, which I think is the standard rate for those kind of effects. But to solve this, you have to have no cards in your hand. Now the thing is, you're discarding 1 when you play this, but you're drawing 2 more. So then you still have to play those 2 cards to have none left in your hand. So it's a little bit awkward there. But if you do get to solve this, at the beginning of your upkeep, you're going to discard your hand and then draw 2 cards. And then you have your draw step and you draw a 3rd card. So you're basically drawing 3 cards every turn in a mono red deck or some other deck possibly. But I think mono red this could work pretty well. You're basically going to draw 3 cards a turn from that point. And the main problem with mono red is it running out of steam by like turn 6 or something. So with this case coming out, I think it's gonna work pretty well at refilling your hand. I don't know if it's going to be like in the best top mono red decks, because a lot of them don't seem to worry too much about drawing cards at the moment because they do damage so fast that they kind of don't need to. But in decks that take a little bit longer, I don't know, this could be one that sees a bit more play. The next card in mono red that I want to have a quick look at is the Prime Novelist. It's a 3-mana 1/3 goblin creature. We have a few good goblins coming in at the moment, so I used to have a goblin deck like 2 or 3 years ago that was really good. So maybe it's going to be time to return to mono red goblins. And it's an uncommon, which is good. And whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and you add a red mana. So um, things like the Anvil, which is still a deck. It feels like it's been around forever, but it's still a deck. You get to add extra mana doing that. You get to add +1 counters on it, which is pretty nice. Also, sacrificing clue tokens. You're sacrificing an artifact. You get the +1 counter. You get your card, and you get 1 mana back. Cost 2 to sacrifice the clue. You get an extra mana back. So it basically kind of discounts that as well. So yeah, I can see that goblin growing relatively quickly in maybe more of a red and black sacrifice style deck. Maybe something with braids. You can sacrifice artifacts every turn. So yeah, keep adding +1 counters on things. So I think that's going to be an interesting card to look out for. Uncommon makes it, kind of more accessible. So that's nice. And then we have Demand Answers. It's a 2-mana instant. And it's as an additional cost to cast a spell, you can sacrifice an artifact or discard a card and draw 2 cards. So normally we'd have things in standard at the moment where you can discard a card, draw 2. So that's your only option. Now, on this one, you do have the ability to instead sacrifice an artifact instead of discarding a card, which makes it a bit more versatile. And in decks where you want to sacrifice artifacts, like with Crime Novelist, you can sacrifice an artifact with Demand Answers. You're drawing 2 cards, but you're also putting a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and adding the red mana. It only costs you 2 here, so it's only cost you 1 for that whole thing to draw 2 cards, add a +1 counter. So Demand Answers is a bit more of a versatile card. I like the fact that you don't have to discard a card. You do have that option. It's a bit more flexible. So I think that's a pretty good addition for certain red decks in standard at the moment. And then we have an interesting new card, which is Fugitive Codebreaker, a 2-mana goblin, again, a 2/1 goblin rogue. It has prowess and it has haste, which is pretty good, and it fits in with other mono red things at the moment, like Monastery Swiftspear. It has disguise, so you can pay 3 to put it out as a 2/2 creature with ward 2 to start with. So, harder to get rid of. Paying mana for the as the ward ability is more feels more kind of disruptive and hard to get around than just paying life, because if you have life as a resource, you just pay it. You're going to save more life in theory. Like with Flesh Gorgers, quite often you just kill it because it's going to do the damage to you. If you don't kill it, you've lost a life either way. With this, if you don't have the extra 2 mana, then you can't do it, right? So it's kind of like gives you a little bit more time and makes it a bit harder for the opponent to actually have to deal with it. So if they don't deal with it, you can pay the disguise cost, which is 6 to start with, but its cost is reduced by 1 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. And with a prowess type deck, with lots of play with fire and lightning strikes and all those other instants and sorceries that you might use in a mono red deck, there's a good chance you're going to have quite a few things in your graveyard already. So you can reduce the cost of this relatively easily, and then it becomes a 2/1 prowess creature. Now you could just do it without the disguise cost. You could just put it out 2/1 prowess with haste, and use your monstrous rage and other things that you would use with a swift spear, and basically you've just got extra, fast explosive power at the beginning. So it's going to be good for that reason as well. I think we're going to see this used a lot in mono red decks at the moment, and as mono red tends to be the deck that I think the majority of people don't like, and yet also the deck that the majority of people probably play, which is kind of funny. I think we'll probably see this quite a lot. And then in red, we've got Incinerator of the Guilty. It's just like, another 6-mana, 6/6 flying trample creature, which we see quite a lot these days, I think. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can collect evidence X. and when you do, it does X damage to each creature and each planeswalker that player controls. So it can be kind of a one-sided board wipe, which is really cool. What I like about this as well, it's probably not going to be used in a Massacre Girl style deck, black and red Massacre Girl kind of deck. But if it was, then because the um, the creature is dealing X damage to each creature and planeswalker, then it's gonna apply the wither effect and give those -1/-1 counters to things as well. If you just do like lightning strike on a creature, burn down the house, that's not going to do the wither effect because your creatures have wither with Massacre Girl, but with Incinerator of the Guilty, it is doing the damage to the creatures and planeswalkers. It would apply that. So you have to look out for that if you're using a Massacre Girl. But yeah, and also it means Incinerator of the Guilty. If it had lifelink somehow, probably not that many ways you'd have this creature and give it lifelink, but it could happen. Then when it does X damage to each creature and each planeswalker, you're going to gain quite a lot of life. So yeah, I think it's an interesting card. Will it be used in Dragon Tribal decks? Maybe. Other big red decks? Possibly. It's not the best. It's only like 1 mana short of being a Tali, and 6 mana is the same as the Carnosaur, which is pretty big, has Discover 5, can be used to do 3 damage to something. So that's pretty versatile as well. So I don't know if it's really going to replace them, but it's something where dragons are relevant. Possibly. We'll see if it comes up. It still looks like a fun card. Next, we're going to move on to more goblins. Krenko, Baron of Tin Street, is a 3 mana legendary goblin, 3/3 creature with haste. So I can see a goblin deck is coming here somewhere. You can tap it to sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control. The more goblins, the better. And obviously, it has haste, so you could play this and attack with it, or you could play it and immediately tap it because haste means it won't be affected by summoning sickness. You can tap it straight away. And whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 red. If you do, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, which also gains haste till end of turn. So you might want to, sacrifice your artifact before combat, make that 1/1 red goblin, and give that haste as well. And then I think, let's see, the way this works on the stack, I'll have to double check by testing this out. But I think you tap, you sacrifice your artifact. I think the +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control goes on the stack. And then I think you have the ability to pay the 1 and create the 1/1 goblin with haste. And if you do that, then I think it will get that 1/1 counter that's on the stack. I'm not entirely sure. It's kind of annoying if it doesn't work that way. If you put +1/+1 counters on what you have now and then make an extra 1/1. So I think, you might know this better than me, but obviously I'll test it out and we'll see for sure. Pretty sure it ends up making a 2/2 goblin instead, which is really, really cool. Grows all the other goblins you might have. So Krenko could definitely, help a mono red goblin artifact sacrificing deck come about, and it'd be interesting to see if it does. And then we're going to move on to the green cards in the set. First one I want to look at is Aftermath Analyst. It's a 2 mana, 1/3 elf detective creature. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards. There's lots of things where milling matters when you're collecting evidence, reanimating things. Green, black cares about what's in the graveyard. And you can pay 4 mana to sacrifice the creature, which is only a 1/3, so it's like not a big loss to sacrifice it, and return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now you can use those lands that enter, sacrifice, go to the graveyard and bring out a basic, so that when you do this, you're definitely going to bring those back. You could use this with Blossoming Tortoise, which is going to put things in the graveyard as well, and possibly put more lands in there. And being able to return everything to the graveyard, from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped, means next turn you're going to have loads of mana for green, which I think is going to be pretty useful. It's a great way to ramp. So I think, I don't do a lot of milling decks myself, like self-milling, green and black decks, but I might try it out with something like Aftermath Analyst. So we'll see about that. The next one in green I want to have a look at is the Archdruid's Charm. Definitely good for mono green. Having 3 green is the casting cost, and it's a very versatile instant. It is a rare, so we'll see. Mono green is not necessarily something I would recommend investing your rare wildcards in at the moment, until it gets stronger and kind of a bit more resilient. But um, this is really cool because it's versatile. You get to choose one of these three options. So you can search your library for a creature or land and reveal it, put it onto the battlefield tapped if it's a land, or into your hand if it's a creature. So basically, any land, doesn't have to be a basic, or any creature, and put it into your hand. So that's pretty good, drawing a card that's exactly what you might need. Or you can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and it deals damage equal to its power to another creature. So it can be used as removal as well, for creatures, but it can also be exiling artifacts or enchantments. And there's a good number of artifacts or enchantments, or artifact and enchantment creatures that you might want to deal with. And obviously, with all the cases that are coming out, which are enchantments, there might be a good number of those you want to get rid of as well. So Archdruid's Charm is so versatile. I really like it. It's mono green, which makes me a little bit more wary of actually using wildcards to craft it. It would be fun to try it out. Um, and it might make mono green a little bit better. It would be nice if you could possibly give something hexproof or something like that. But yeah, no, it's still pretty good. And there are some good green cards coming up here that I really like. The first of which green creatures I like is the Axebane Ferox. So it's 4 mana, 4/4, Death Touch Haste. Makes me feel a little bit like Resting Beast, but it's not the same. But 4/4 Death Touch Haste is pretty difficult to deal with. Do you block it and lose creatures, or do maybe you can't block it because it's coming out by surprise? But it also has Ward, Collect Evidence 4. Now with this, you're going to be really careful about what's in a graveyard because you might want to possibly exile graveyards, and there are ways of doing that. Because if there isn't anything in the graveyard that is 4 mana or more, then the opponent cannot target this. It's basically hexproof. Obviously, you can depopulate, you can sunfall, you can farewell. You can get rid of it with non-targeting removal spells, but you can't get around, that ward ability directly with removal. And even the longer buy won't target it because it's mana value 4, and that only targets mana value 3 or less. So it does get around some things. It does make it kind of resilient, which I really like. You might want to play some other things that remove things from the graveyard as well, like what's that one called? The Phyrexian Scrap Gorger, that's going to like tap and remove something from the graveyard every turn. Or even something like Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Maybe wouldn't necessarily be in this deck with this creature, but anything that you've got that can remove things from the graveyard, unlicensed hearse, I don't know, something like that, to make sure the graveyards are kept clean and the Ferox cannot be targeted. It's going to be a pretty difficult creature to deal with if you can keep the graveyards clean like that. Then moving on to not just mono green, the case of the Locked Hothouse. It's a 4 mana enchantment case where you can play an additional land on each of your turns, and to solve it, you have to control 7 or more lands. And when I'm looking at anything that cares about 7 or more lands and can help you ramp, I'm always thinking of like the Domain Ramp Atraxa type deck. And so yeah, if you solve this, if you control 7 or more lands, which isn't that difficult in that kind of deck with Topiary Stompers and Invasions of Zendikar, then you may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you can play lands and cast creature and enchantment spells from the top of your library. Now, is there anything in that deck that isn't a land, a creature, or an enchantment? Yes, the Invasion of Zendikar. Okay, but apart from that, I'm not sure if there's really necessarily that much, and this might even replace Invasion of Zendikar. I don't know. It doesn't help you ramp quite as fast unless you have too many lands in your hand, but being able to cast things from the top of your library at any time means you're going to ramp faster because you can play lands from the top of your library, and you can do, at least 2 of them on a turn. But you can also cast your Atraxas, Atalis, your the Angel, Archangel of Wrath. But you can also do things like, your 1 mana Leyline Binding, which is an enchantment off the top of your library anytime. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we'd keep some Zendikars in that kind of deck, but I definitely want to try a case of the Locked Hothouse in a Traxxas domain type deck, because I think it's going to help it, just keep a lot of momentum and cost so much that you just can't keep up with that level of power. So yeah, definitely want to try that one out. Another case that you might want to try out and might work well with something like the Ferox When it enters the battlefield, you distribute 2+1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures you control. Okay, to solve it, creatures you control have total power 8 or greater. That's a 4/4, you're adding 2, that's 6, if you happen to have those. So it's not too hard to get to 8. And mono green does tend to have some pretty strong, powerful creatures. So I don't think that's too hard to solve. And when it is solved, whenever you attack, you put a +1/+1 counter on a target attacking creature and it gains trample until end of turn. Now, the reason why I think this works really well with the Ferox is because um, if you have this out, if you've solved it already, you play a Ferox. It's a 4/4 Death Touch Haste. You attack. You can put a +1 counter on it. It's now a 5/5 Death Touch Haste with potential, hexproof. Um, and it gains trample till end of turn. And if there's anything better than trample, it's trample with Death Touch. Because you can attack with a 5/5 trample Death Touch creature, and they can block with, their Atraxa or whatever it might be. They can block with a huge creature. Atraxa is not the best example because it has lifelink. They can block with a 10/10 that doesn't have lifelink, and you do 1 damage to the creature, and it dies, and you do the 4 remaining damage to their life points as well. So it's a great way of getting through big creatures. If they have lifelink, it's going to kind of balance that out. So forget that example. But yeah, +1 counters, making it stronger, giving it trample as well as death touch. I think that would be pretty fun to try out. Otherwise, will this work in maybe other +1 counter style decks like the Botanical Brawler? Possibly, but that already has trample. But there are other creatures that could benefit from that trample that don't have it, that get really strong as it is. Um, so yeah, I think that's going to be a pretty interesting one to try out. It's probably not going to be everywhere, but I'd definitely give it a go. Another green creature you might want to look out for is the Pride of Hull Clade. It's 11 mana. 2/15 legendary creature, crocodile, elk, turtle. Random creature types, but sure, why not? But it costs X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of creatures you control. So there are a few creatures still out in standard that have huge toughness, or maybe do damage equal to their toughness rather than their power. Um, so this doesn't have to cost 11 mana. This can be quite a lot cheaper. It is also Defender, which is not great to start with, but you can also pay 4 mana, which is 2 and 2 blue. Till end of turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0 gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player. Draw cards equal to its toughness and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So you can do that on itself. You're now attacking with a 2/15 or 3/15, and if you have one of those cards that allows it to do damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, then actually you're hitting for potentially 15 damage. It's a shame it doesn't have trample. But yeah, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw cards equal to its toughness. If that did have trample, which you could give it trample with something like that case, the trample garden, give it trample. There's other ways you can give it trample, obviously. You could draw potentially 15 cards. Okay, so that's going to be interesting. Is that going to work in a heavy toughness creature deck? I don't know. Like obviously, it's a pretty good blocker for pretty much anything, apart from Death Touch. 15 is a really, really big, big toughness for a creature. So we'll see, like it needs to be in a deck that has lots of other big toughness creatures to make it less than 11, because no one's going to pay 11 to cast this. But it'll be interesting to see if that actually becomes a thing. I don't think people will, but I'd like to try it. Another one that might be good for some mono green decks is Sharp-Eyed Rookie. It's a 2 mana, 2/2 vigilant creature to start with. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if its power is greater than the rookie's power or its toughness is greater than the rookie's toughness, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you get to investigate. So it's a bit like the evolving adaptive. It'll get bigger as long as something bigger comes out. So that's good, things can keep growing. You can keep putting out bigger and bigger creatures with mono green pretty easily. You also get the extra clue token, so you can keep drawing extra cards and keep, keep getting those cards out. which is another thing with mono green, which is a bit of a problem at the moment. It doesn't seem to draw too many cards when you really want it to. So Sharp-Eyed Rookie, potentially a card that's going to help mono green get somewhere. It's a rare, so again, you might not want to craft it just to try it out if you're being careful about your wild cards. But I think I'd probably give it a go. Like, will it work in a human deck? Probably not, because human creatures aren't going to scale in power in the same way. So maybe just some, big mono green monsters type deck. Maybe that would work with that one. So we're going to move on quickly to the multicolored cards, and the first one I want to look at is Ansrag the Quake Mole. It's a 4-mana, 8/4 legendary creature mole god. Whenever it attacks, if it becomes blocked, you get to untap each creature you control, and after this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase, so you get to attack again. And if the opponent blocks again, then you get another combat phase. So you can basically just keep attacking because they're probably going to want to block this because it's an 8/4. And if they do, well, then, you're going to keep getting combat phases until they don't. So that makes it a really, really good creature just to keep attacking with over and over again. And if you do get to the point where you have 7 mana to use the ability, it must be blocked each combat this turn if able. So now they don't even have a choice. They have to block it. Although by that point, I kind of feel like they might have 4 power, to be able to just block it with everything just to kill it. So, interesting creature to try out. It would be cool if got that to work. Maybe if we somehow gave it indestructible as well, then the opponent has to block it, and it still won't do any good if they block it. So, we'll see about that. Probably not going to be a top tier deck, but it might be a fun one to try. Then we've got Assassin's Trophy, so that's green and black, 2-mana instant. Destroy target permanent an opponent controls. They may search their library for a basic land card, put it out on the battlefield, then shuffle. So you can take out their non-basic lands with this. You can take out basic lands if you really want to, but I'm not quite sure what the point would be. But you can take out those non-basic lands. Well, actually, no, you could do. If the opponent has ossification, attaches the ossification to one of their basic lands, you could destroy that one and get your creature back. Sure, yeah, probably do that. But also, basically, just kill anything and helps them ramp a little bit. But 2-mana instant, destroy pretty much anything is not too bad. I think it's a pretty good deal. Then we've got Aurelia, the Law Above. So it's a 5-mana, 4/4 legendary angel, and there's lots of really good angels at the moment. I quite like angel decks, and angels work so well with each other that it's great to have that kind of synergistic angel tribal deck. So yeah, it has flying, it has vigilance, and it has haste, which is quite a lot. And whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you get to draw a card, whether that player is you or someone else. And whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, you get to do 3 damage to each of your opponents. So on Arena, obviously just one opponent, but if you're playing with more opponents, get some more of them, and you gain 3 life as well. So if you have lots of creatures attacking all over the place, you're going to be drawing cards, you're going to be gaining life and doing damage. And flying, vigilance, and haste still really good. Vigilance is still really important, especially when the Wandering Emperor is around and will be around until like September this year. So you don't want your creatures to get exiled with Wandering Emperor. So vigilance actually is a pretty useful keyword, pretty important. Next, we're going to move on to Breakout. It's a 2-mana sorcery where you can look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them. If that card has mana value 2 or less, you may put it onto the battlefield against haste till end of turn. If you didn't put the revealed card onto the battlefield, you put it into your hand instead. Now, the best thing about this, I think, is filling your deck with the best red and green 2-mana creatures. Because then this basically becomes a 2-mana sorcery to find any creature from your deck. Well, not any creature from the top 6 cards of your library. So there's a good chance you're going to find, you've got to find at least one creature. Or you'll have an option of a few different creatures. You get to give them haste. You get to put them out onto the battlefield. You get to do some damage straight away. Still, being able to put a bigger creature into your hand is not a bad thing. But maybe there's going to be some red and green, small creature aggro decks. I quite like that kind of deck. We'll see if that works out, but I think this is a really good card to help enable that. Moving on quickly through these multicolored cards, the next one I really want to try out is Judith Carnage Connoisseur. So it's a 5-mana which is a black and red. 3/4 human shaman creature. Legendary. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you get to choose one. Either that spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink, pretty good, or you get to create a 2/2 red imp creature that when it dies can do 2 damage to each opponent. So it's going to make all your removal spells, all your um, well, any other instance of sorceries really, really versatile. If it's just a black, cut down, go for the throat, you get to make yourself an imp creature as well, which is pretty good value. Getting a 2/2 creature and something that can do 2 damage when it dies is really useful. But also, I like the fact that you can give your spells Death Touch and Lifelink. Now, that might not work necessarily so well with the majority of black removal spells, black instants and sorceries. They don't tend to do damage to the opponent's creatures necessarily. But there are red instants and sorceries that will do pretty good here as well. Obviously, just, play with fire is great because you get to kill anything and gain 2 life just for 2 mana, which, for 1 mana with play with fire, so that's pretty good. But also, something like End the Festivities, doing 1 damage to just your opponent's creatures and getting Death Touch and Lifelink. The Lifelink is nice, but not the point. It's the Death Touch. You can basically 1 mana, 1-sided board wipe with End the Festivities. So, will that be a big thing? Probably not, but I will like to try that out with Judith. I think that'd be pretty fun to work out. Then we've got Kaya Spirit's Justice you can get with the Mastery Pass pre-order bundle. So I think a lot of people are going to be trying this out because a lot of people are going to be getting at least 1 copy if they get that pre-order bundle. But yeah, we want to basically exile things from the graveyard, which you can do it with collecting evidence. You can do it with the other things we said, Agatha's Soul Cauldron, Unlicensed Hearse, all kinds of things that can exile from the graveyard. Or obviously ways to exile creatures on the battlefield like Sunfall or other direct exile effect spells. And you get to copy a creature where a token you control becomes a copy of it. And obviously, like Kaya can do this herself with a +2 ability, Surveil 2, then you exile a card from a graveyard. So you can put the card in the graveyard and then exile it instantly. So you can kind of, turn tokens into these potentially big creatures every turn, or other creatures that do all kinds of different effects. It can do the +1 ability to make a token if you don't have one already. So that kind of prepares it for the +2. And you can also do the -2, where you exile a creature that you control. Each other player exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. So you can make, a 1/1 spirit creature and exile it to exile something of the opponent's. So it's pretty versatile. It does some good things controlling the board. We do have some good white and black, possibly planeswalker orientated control decks at the moment that people like to play. So I think Kaya will fit in pretty well with that. We've then got Leyline of the Guild Pact. It's a 4 mana, potentially mono green or potentially pretty much all colours. It's an enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. So that saves you a lot of time. You don't have to get the 4 mana to actually play it. And each non-land permanent you control is all colours, and lands you control are every basic land type in addition to the other types. So this is, a turn 1 um, Leyline Binding, Leyline of the Guild Pact comes out, you play 1 land, you now have 1 mana up, and that land is every basic land type. So basically, you can play your Leyline Binding. So, not bad. It has to be white, I guess, right? It has to be able to tap for white. I think that's how that works. Every basic land type, but it doesn't change the mana you can tap it for. I believe that's right. So yeah, possibly great in a domain deck. It's going to help, basically domain works no matter what, right? So whether that's the attracts a ramp deck or something else, I think it's going to be a pretty interesting one to see how people use that. Then we have Lightning Helix. I really like this because I like red and white decks that do some cool things. 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life would be good in an Arcane Bombardment style deck, which I really like. And that card's still around until like September, so sure, I'm going to give this a go in an Arcane Bombardment deck, swapping out Sacred Fire, because that's basically 2 damage and 2 life, and that can make a big difference. So yeah, Lightning Helix is a really good reprint, so it's great to have that in standard now. But we're going to move on quickly to get through to the last cards here. We've got No More Lies, which is a white and blue, so 2 mana counter spell. but the opponent has to pay 3 to stop, their spell being countered. And if they don't, you get to exile it instead of putting it into the owner's graveyard. So it's better than make disappear effectively in a white and blue deck. Make disappear, obviously, better. It's not better, it's the only option if you're going to have, a blue deck without white. You can't play No More Lies, obviously. So yeah, I think we'll see this a lot in blue and white control decks. Like the least fun decks to play against, but it's definitely an upgrade on Make Disappear. So I can see that being used quite a lot at the moment. Then we've got Rakdos, Patron of Chaos. It's another 6 mana, 6/6 flying creature. It's got trample. It has this really, really cool ability. At the beginning of your end step, target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land, non-token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. So they have to have 2 non-land, non-token permanents to sacrifice. Otherwise, you get 2 cards, which is great. If they do sacrifice 2 non-token, non-land permanents, they're going to want to kill this as quickly as possible, because otherwise you're drawing 2 extra cards every turn if they run out of things to sacrifice. So it's great removing things, it's great drawing cards. I'm definitely going to try it out in some decks. It's a shame it's 6 mana. It would be great if it was 5 mana. Even if it was like flying 4/4, I would love it, because, the Carnosaur, possibly discover it if it costs 5 or less. So I can see it might be too strong if you could. But yeah, no, 6 mana, 6/6 that makes the opponent sacrifice things, and it can't be tokens, it can't be lands. Otherwise, you draw 2 cards. I think is really powerful. So I'm definitely going to want to try that out in some decks. Then we've got another new card that I really like, and white and red decks I do quite like these days. War Leader's Call is a 3 mana enchantment that gives your creatures +1/+1, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, this will deal 1 damage to each opponent. So pinging for damage every so often is really good. There's quite a few things you can do with red that will, like Virtue of Courage will exile a card from the top of your library when you do damage. You could potentially keep things going by keep exiling cards off the top of your library and playing additional ones. But what I really like with War Leader's Call is the idea of playing it with Axonil, because Axonil will change from a 4/4 to a 5/5. So it gets +1/+1. And then whenever anything of yours enters the battlefield, this will do 5 damage to the opponent. So you just need to play this on turn 3, Axonil on turn 4, and then turn 5, whatever you can to play some extra creatures, Lethal Demolition, Resolute Reinforcements, Song of Totentans, whatever you need to get as many creatures out as possible. On turn 5, Burn Down the House will do it, make your 3 Devil tokens, and that does 15 damage to the opponent. When the Devils die, then they'll do another, they'll do more damage. They'll do the 5 damage as well because of Axonil. So yeah, you're basically, potentially there, attacking for making Burn Down the House Devil tokens that will do 5 damage each. That's 15 damage to the opponent. You can attack. If they block, if they kill your creatures, they then get to do 5 damage again. So huge amounts of damage. I can see that working out pretty well. I'm definitely going to be trying that as soon as possible once a new set comes out. And then finally, and not insignificantly, we have loads more 2-color lands. We have these lands that can surveil when they enter. So not only is it great having more 2-color lands, they are rares, obviously, which most of them are. It's better than the lands that scry when you enter, because you have the chance to put this into your graveyard, and that can be important for lots of different deck types. But what's different about these is they also have both types on them, which means they might be good for domain style decks as well, because it cares about the type, and not all 2-color lands will have, mountain and plains or mountain and forest on them. They might just be a land. So those lands are going to be really important going forward. I can see lots of people wanting to get those, and the benefit of these, they come in tapped, which isn't ideal, but there has to be some drawback. The benefit of these is if you collect these when they come out, they're going to be around for basically 2.5 years. So until 2027, is that right? I think that's right. So September 2027, I think it is. And yeah, they're going to be around for a long time. So these are going to be wild cards worth spending. because you're going to get a lot of use out of them. And yeah, lands are pretty much the best thing you can spend your rare wild cards on long term. So definitely have a look at all those 2-color lands that are coming out in the new set as well. So that's basically all we have time for. There's a lot of cards to go through. Obviously, I don't want to go through every single card because there's so many cards that might just be only valuable in draft games or might be valuable in other, other formats like Brawl, which I don't necessarily cover. This is mainly looking at Standard. So yeah, those are my top picks for the new set. We'll see which ones actually have an effect on Standard, because with so many cards in Standard at the moment, and it's still growing until like September when we're going to start losing some things again. With so many cards out, every new card that comes in has a smaller impact than the new cards that came before it. So whatever we get here, there might only be a handful of cards that actually change the top most played decks. So hopefully, some of these cards I've pointed out today will be in those. Maybe there's going to be some that I haven't looked at that are going to become really popular. Let me know in the comments if there's any certain cards you're looking forward to that I haven't mentioned, or maybe, the ones that I have mentioned as well. Let me know which ones you think are going to be the most popular, because as of this video uploading, tomorrow the new set is coming out. But by the time you're watching this, it might already be out. So let me know what cards you're looking forward to, or what cards you found that are really good. If that set's already out, if you're watching this later. Yeah, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on any future videos. I just want to say thanks for watching this video to the end. I will see you guys in the next video.